The two black Escalades pulled into the lot at 7 minutes past closing, and Blythe didn't move from her desk. She'd known this visit was coming. She'd known it the way she knew a spreadsheet was wrong before she could identify the error. A tension in the numbers, a wrongness that lived in the gut before it registered in the brain. For 3 weeks, she'd balanced the books on borrowed time, and borrowed time, like every other kind of debt, eventually came due. She pulled her reading glasses off and set them on top of the Harwick fabrication file. 3 inches thick. 4 years of slow financial bleeding that her mother had tried to stop with a co-signature on a loan she had no business signing. Eleanor Carran had trusted a handshake and a man who smiled too easily. Then Eleanor had died of a stroke 18 months ago and left Blythe the firm, the furniture, and a debt to Seward's people that had quietly doubled with interest since the funeral. She heard the lot door open. The winter air hit the building before the footsteps did, that particular Hamilton January cold that got into the mortar and never fully left. The kind of cold that made people desperate, the kind that got people killed. 4 men. She counted them through the frosted glass partition without turning her head. 4 sets of footsteps, one heavier than the others, moving without hurry. The office door opened. The man who walked in first wasn't the largest, but he was the one the room reorganized itself around. Cormac Seward stood just over 6 feet, the kind of build that came from decades of physical consequence, not a gym membership. He wore a dark wool overcoat that looked like it cost more than Blythe's quarterly hydro bill. His hair was going silver at the temples. There was a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, faded but unmistakable, that hadn't come from anything polite. 3 men fanned out behind him. Knox, she recognized him from when she'd seen the crew near the fabrication yard, stationed himself by the door. The other 2 she didn't know. They all wore the careful blankness of people paid to be invisible. Seward looked around the office the way people looked at properties they were considering demolishing. Then he looked at her. Mrs. Carran. His voice was flat, measured. A man who had learned a long time ago that volume was for people who weren't sure they were being heard. Mr. Seward. She didn't stand. She folded her hands on the desk. I assume this isn't about tax season. Something moved across his face. Not a smile exactly, an acknowledgement. Your mother's firm co-signed the Harwick note in 2021. The principal was $240,000, with accumulated interest and service fees. The current balance is just over $380. I know what the balance is, Blythe said. I've been recalculating it every month since the estate was settled. I know it to the dollar. Then you know why I'm here. I know why you're here. What I don't know is why you needed 4 of them to come with you. The man named Knox shifted near the door. Seward didn't look at him. I have a proposal, Seward said. He reached into his overcoat and set an envelope on the desk between them. Thick, cream-colored. The kind of envelope people used when they wanted the contents to feel substantial. The debt in full disappears. The Harwick note, the accrued interest, the service fees, erased from my ledger entirely. Blythe didn't touch the envelope. And what does erased look like from your end? You continue operating Carran Accounting. You take on a new client, several, actually, all legitimate corporations, all registered in Ontario. You prepare their returns, their quarterlies, their filings, everything above board, everything clean. He paused. You become the public face of my legitimate holdings. Nothing illegal passes through you. You sign what's real, you file what's accurate. She looked at him. That's the offer. That's the offer. The 2 men she didn't know were watching her the way people watched something they expected to break. Knox was watching the parking lot through the frosted glass. Seward was watching her the way she'd watched the Harwick file, looking for where the numbers didn't add up. Blythe picked up the envelope. She turned it over once. Then she held it out toward him. No, she said. The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Seward didn't move, Mrs. Carran. I know what that arrangement looks like from the inside, Blythe said, and she was surprised by how steady her own voice was. She'd been practicing this conversation in her head for weeks, but she hadn't expected to feel this calm doing it. I've seen the books of 3 different firms that tried it. One lost their CPA license, one lost their house. The third one, she stopped. Set the envelope down on the desk between them, not hand it to him, just set down. I do clean books, Mr. Seward. That's all I do. I'm not interested in becoming the respectable wallpaper someone hangs over their dirty walls. Knox turned from the window. One of the unnamed men took a step forward. Seward raised one hand, barely a movement, just an elevation of 2 fingers, and both men went still. You understand the alternative, Seward said. Quiet, not threatening, just accurate. I understand perfectly, Blythe said. You foreclose on everything associated with the Harwick note. That's this building, the equipment lease, and whatever my mother's signature is worth to you in court. You'll get less than 100,000 out of it. You'll spend half that on your lawyers. She held his gaze. I've run the numbers, Mr. Seward. It's a bad return on your time. Something changed in his face. Not much. A fractional recalibration, like a column that had been entered wrong and was being corrected. You ran the numbers, he said. I run numbers. That's what I do. She pushed her reading glasses to the side and opened the Harwick file with flat efficiency, turning it toward him so he could see the last page. A summary sheet she'd prepared. Not for him, just for herself, because she couldn't stop herself from doing it. 12 months of projections under 6 different scenario models. If you liquidate everything linked to the note, you recover about 92,000 in a good outcome, 78 in a realistic one. Legal and collection costs eat another 20 to 30% of that. You'd walk away with 60,000 on a $380,000 balance. She closed the file. That's not a proposal worth saying yes to for either of us. The silence in the office had a particular quality to it. Blythe had sat through a lot of silences. Client silences when she told them they owed more than they thought, auditor silences when she handed over documentation that was exactly right and they'd been hoping it wasn't. This silence felt different. It felt like something recalculating. Seward picked up the envelope from the desk. He didn't put it back in his pocket. He set it on the corner of her filing cabinet, just slightly out of reach. Then he looked at Knox and the other 2 men. Wait in the car, he said. Knox opened his mouth. Seward looked at him once. Knox closed his mouth, nodded, and jerked his chin at the others. Within 30 seconds, the office held only 2 people, and the cold draft from the closed door, and the sound of the January wind off the escarpment pressing at the windows. Blythe didn't move. Seward looked at the Harwick file. May I? He said, which was not a question she had expected from him. She nodded, because she didn't have a coherent reason not to. He pulled the chair from the other side of her desk, a cheap thing on wheels, a client chair she'd never replaced, and sat down. He opened the file. He didn't flip through it. He started at page 1, and he read. Blythe watched him. He had the eyes of someone who had spent years reading things that mattered. He moved through the pages with that same unhurried competence he'd walked in with, but something about it was different at close range. Less performance. He turned a page, his finger stopping on a line item, his brow furrowed. Your mother restructured the interest schedule in September 2022, he said. It was not a question. She did. She found a clause in the original note that allowed for a renegotiation window. She missed it the first time. She wasn't an accountant. She was a bookkeeper. There's a difference. But she went back and found it and filed a formal request for restructuring. My contact at the time. Blythe paused. He told her the clause wasn't applicable. Seward looked up at her. It was applicable, Blythe said flatly. I checked. If the restructure had gone through, the interest rate drops from 16% to 9%. The current balance would be 260,000, not 380. The man she spoke to was either incompetent or deliberately misled her. She held Seward's gaze. I don't know which, but either way it's the reason this number is wrong, and I don't sign off on numbers that are wrong. The room was very quiet. You've had this information for how long? Seward asked. 11 months. And you didn't bring it forward. I brought it forward, Blythe said. Twice. In writing. Once to a man named Ferrante. She watched Seward's expression. Didn't see recognition exactly, but saw attention. And once to a general inbox that bounced the email back as undeliverable. Neither attempt produced a response. Seward set the file down slowly. He stared at the summary page, her projection sheet, her 6 scenarios, and she watched him absorb the numbers the way someone absorbed a language they hadn't spoken in a while. Recognizing it, finding it familiar. I'm going to need to see the original correspondence, he said. I have copies. She opened her second desk drawer, pulled out a manila folder she'd had ready since October, and set it on the desk. He didn't touch it immediately. He looked at her instead, and it was the first time since he'd walked in that she felt genuinely uncertain what he was thinking. Why didn't you use this to negotiate down, he said. At any point in the last 11 months, you had leverage. Because the leverage only works if the other side is willing to look at the evidence, Blythe said. And in my experience, the people your operation sends to collect don't particularly want to look at evidence. They want signatures. Seward sat back in the client chair. It creaked under his weight. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular. The wall behind her, the window, the worn edge of the desk. I was 14, he said finally, which was not what she expected him to say. When I started keeping the books for the man who ran my neighborhood. Not formally, I just noticed things. He was losing $200 a week through his corner operation because the person handling the cash couldn't count change under pressure. He stopped, started again. I told him. He paid me to fix it. That was the beginning of it. Blythe didn't say anything. I've been in rooms with accountants, lawyers, auditors, Seward continued. Every one of them eventually found a way to be useful to me that I didn't ask for. Something extra, an adjustment, an omission, a rounding error that happened to go the right direction. His eyes came back to 11 months and you didn't try anything, not even something small and deniable. No, Blythe said. Why? Because the books are wrong if they're wrong, she said. I can't fix a thing by making it more wrong. That's not how any of this works. He looked at her for a long time. Then he opened the manila folder and began to read. They stayed in the office for an hour and 40 minutes. Blythe made tea, not for politeness, because the building heat had been unreliable all winter and her hands were cold. And he didn't comment on being handed a mug, just wrapped both hands around it and kept reading. He asked questions, specific ones. When did the September filing go in? Who signed the restructuring request? Had the original note been notarized or witnessed? She answered them all, and she watched him build something in his head, some internal accounting of what had gone wrong and who was responsible. Knox knocked on the door at 8:15. Seward told him to go get something to eat. Knox knocked again at 9. Seward told him the same thing. At 9:40, Seward set the folder down. He looked at his hands, large, scarred across the knuckles, a faint chemical burn on the inside of the right wrist she hadn't noticed before. Ferrante doesn't work for me anymore, he said. He left the operation 14 months ago under circumstances I'm not going to detail. He looked up at her. If he told your mother the clause wasn't applicable, and it was, that was either his mistake or it was personal. Either way, it's not your debt to carry. Blythe kept her voice very even. Are you telling me the balance is wrong? I'm telling you the balance is going to be recalculated. He closed the folder. The correct figure will be sent to you in writing within 5 business days. She stared at him. Mrs. Carran. You came here tonight to collect $380,000, she said. I came here tonight to resolve a debt, he said. The debt is not what I thought it was. That's a different situation. He stood, picked up his overcoat from where he'd draped it across the arm of the client chair. The offer I made when I walked in, I'm withdrawing it. What I proposed wasn't appropriate to your specific circumstances. Blythe didn't know what to do with her hands. She put them flat on the desk. You drove across the city in January with 4 men to offer me a deal, and now you're... I made the offer based on incorrect information, Seward said. He said it plainly, without defensive heat. I was told the debt was straightforward. It's not. I don't make arrangements based on bad information. He tucked the folder under one arm. I'll take this for reference. I'll return it. You can take it, she said. I have copies of everything. He picked up the envelope from the corner of the filing cabinet. He put it in his pocket. Then he stopped at the office door and turned back. The projection sheet, he said. The 6 scenarios. Did you run those for the benefit of a meeting you thought you'd have with my people, or do you do that generally? Blythe blinked. I do it generally. When I have a file that's distressed, I run the projections because... She stopped. It felt suddenly absurd to explain. Because I need to know how bad each version of bad actually is. So I can stop worrying about the versions that aren't likely. Seward looked at her in a way she couldn't quite decode. Not the appraiser look from when he'd first walked in. Something quieter than that. That's a useful habit, he said. He left. The door closed behind him. Blythe heard the Escalade start up in the lot, and the sound of them pulling away, and then the office was just her, and the tea getting cold, and the Harwick file and the Hamilton Winter pressing at the glass. She sat down and realized her hands were shaking slightly. She put them flat on her thighs and breathed. The corrected figure arrived 4 days later, a formal letter, typed on paper with no letterhead, signed by a name she didn't recognize. The balance was $243,000. The original principal plus 9% interest, properly calculated from the beginning. Still more than she could pay, but real, accurate. There was a handwritten line at the bottom. A payment schedule can be arranged at your convenience. C.S. She set the letter down and looked at her mother's framed CPA certificate on the wall. Eleanor had hung it herself, slightly crooked, and Blythe had never straightened it because fixing it felt like erasing something. 2 weeks passed. She worked. She filed 3 corporate returns, caught a $1,500 error in a client's payroll remittances that saved them a penalty, and ate most of her lunches at her desk because January in Hamilton was not a good month for wanting to go outside. On a Thursday afternoon, she was doing the quarterly for a small plumbing supply company when she heard a car in the lot again. This time only one. She was at the door before she'd made a conscious decision to move. Seward stood in the lot alone. He was in the same dark wool overcoat, but without the crew, without the performance of it. He was carrying 2 cups from the Tim Hortons 2 blocks east, which was such an ordinary and improbable detail that she stopped in the doorway and just looked at him. I had a question about the Harwick note, he said. The original underwriting documentation. Do you have the lender's copies or only the co-signers? Co-signers, she said. Why? Because if there's a lender's copy with a different clause notation, Ferrante's version of what he told your mother becomes a documentable misrepresentation. That's a different kind of problem. He held out one of the cups. Medium, 1 milk. I asked Knox what you drank. He didn't know. I guessed. Blythe looked at the cup. She took it. It was the right order. She stepped back from the doorway. He came in. They spent the afternoon on it, the actual underwriting file, which she found in her mother's archival storage in the back room, a box she'd avoided because it was Eleanor's handwriting on the labels, and she hadn't been ready for that yet. Seward didn't comment on the pause she took before opening it. He just waited. He was different, alone. Not softer, that wasn't the right word. Less composed, maybe. He drank his coffee too fast, and then held the empty cup for 20 minutes without noticing. He had a way of going very still when he was reading something that surprised him, just a momentary arrest, and then continuing. She caught herself watching for it. At some point she asked him why he was doing this, not the collecting, not the debt, why he was here personally, going through archival boxes in a small accounting office when presumably he had people for this. He was quiet for a moment. Ferrante misled your mother, he said. My operation, my responsibility. He set the document he'd been reading face down on the table. She died without knowing the amount was wrong. He stopped. That matters. Most people in your position would argue the liability isn't personal, Blythe said. Most people in my position are wrong about a lot of things, he said, and didn't elaborate. She found the lender's copy at the bottom of the third box. The clause notation was different, a different section reference, a number that redirected to a subsection that made the restructuring window explicitly applicable. Clear as a column header. Her mother had been right. Ferrante had lied. Blythe sat on the cold floor of the storage room, holding the document, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since the estate reading. Eleanor Carran had not been foolish. She had found the right clause and asked the right questions and been deliberately denied. She became aware that Seward had come to the storage room doorway and was watching her. She wasn't crying. She wasn't going to cry in front of this man, but her throat was tight and her hands were not entirely steady, and he could probably see all of it. He didn't say anything. He held out his hand for the document. She gave it to him. He looked at it for a long time. "This settles the debt," he said finally, "entirely. Misrepresentation in the original enforcement means the note is unenforceable." He set the document carefully on top of the box. "I'll have that put in writing and delivered to you by the end of the week." Blythe stood up. Her knees ached from the floor. "You don't have to do that." "I know." "The written correspondence I sent," she started, "was ignored," he said, "by someone who doesn't work for me anymore for reasons that are now obvious." He looked at her directly. "I'm sorry for what your mother was put through and for the time you spent trying to correct it." Blythe had not expected an apology from Cormac Seward. She didn't know what to do with it. She picked up the document and began sorting the archival box back into order. Because she needed something to do with her hands. Because the alternative was standing there in her dead mother's storage room, feeling things she hadn't scheduled to feel. "The proposal you made when you first came," she said. "The accounting arrangement. I withdrew it." "I know. I'm asking about it anyway." She closed the box flap. "Why me, specifically? You have operations across the city. You must have a dozen accountants who'll do what you need." Seward leaned in the doorway. The light from the back room was behind him, and she couldn't see his face as clearly. "Because you wrote 2 letters to a dead inbox and kept writing correct documents anyway," he said. "Because you ran 6 scenarios on a debt you didn't owe. Because you needed to know how bad each version of bad actually was. Because when I walked into your office with 4 men and a prepared offer, you did arithmetic out loud in front of us and told me why my own deal didn't make sense." He straightened, came slightly more into the light. "I don't need an accountant," he said. "I need someone who does the books right because the books are right, not because they're afraid of what happens if they're wrong." He paused. "I haven't met many people like that." Blythe looked at him. She thought about the letter with CS at the bottom. She thought about the Tim Hortons cup, the right order, the fact that he'd driven here himself without Knox or the others. She thought about her mother's handwriting on the box labels. Harwick 2021. Harwick 2022. "The proposal," she said. "If I had considered it, and I'm not saying I would have, but if I had, the thing I would have needed is that nothing comes through my books that isn't accurate. No omissions, no adjustments, nothing I can't sign my name to and sleep that night." "I understood that after 20 minutes in your office," Seward said. "And the other thing," she said, "I'm not a front. I'm not a name on a letterhead. If I'm doing the accounts, I'm doing the accounts. I ask questions when something looks off. I flag discrepancies. I don't manufacture numbers, and I don't hide ones that are inconvenient." "I would expect that," he said, "from anyone doing the work correctly. Most of the people in your world don't expect that. They expect the opposite." "Most of the people in my world," he said, "are working from the wrong set of expectations." Blythe was quiet for a moment. "I'm not accepting your proposal," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I've withdrawn it. I know. I'm proposing something different." She crossed her arms because the storage room was cold and because she needed the structure of it. "If you want clean books for your legitimate operations, I will take them on as a client. Standard fees, standard reporting, standard engagement letter. I file what's accurate, I flag what isn't, and if I ever see something that crosses a line I cannot cross, I exit the engagement with 30 days' notice and no further obligation on either side. She held his gaze. That's what I offer, not whatever you walked in here with 2 weeks ago. Seward looked at her for a long moment. That same stillness she'd learned to recognize, the one that meant something had surprised him. That's a fair arrangement, he said. It's the only arrangement I make, she said. He nodded once. I'll have my lawyer send an engagement letter for your review. I'll have my lawyer review it and I'll mark it up extensively, she said. I'm thorough. I noticed, Seward said. He picked up his overcoat from where he'd left it on the hallway hook on his way in. Not her hook. She hadn't offered the hook, he'd just used it. Which should have annoyed her and somehow hadn't. And he turned toward the front of the office. At the main door he stopped. The Harwick file, he said. You were working on it when we came in the first time. I work on all my files, she said. The fabrication shop is in receivership. The equipment's been seized. But the building lease has 8 months left and the space is sound. There's a heritage designation application on the property that's been stalled at the city because no one's filed the supporting cost documentation. Blythe stared at him. I may have some familiarity with the file, he said, which was the driest thing she had ever heard a human being say. The heritage documentation requires a qualified assessor, she said, and a financial viability statement. I know what it requires. He opened the door and the January air came in, sharp and clean and cold as the inside of a bank vault. If you know someone who does financial statements and has a professional relationship with an underperforming industrial property in the lower city, it might be worth looking at. He walked out. The door drifted closed behind him. Blythe stood in the middle of her office, in the cold she hadn't heated properly all winter, next to her mother's slightly crooked CPA certificate, holding an empty Tim Hortons cup. Then she sat down at her desk, opened a new file folder, and wrote Harwick, Heritage Designation on the tab. She started the spreadsheet from the beginning, not because she had a client, not because she had an agreement or a retainer or a signed engagement letter, because the numbers existed, and the numbers were wrong, and that was reason enough to start. Outside, one black Escalade idled at the edge of the lot for a minute longer than it needed to, before it finally pulled away into the grey Hamilton afternoon. Blythe didn't look up from her screen. She was already 3 rows into the projection.